Facebook, which I think we are now. And if you're just coming in, welcome to Book Sandwiched In. I'm Isaac Shub. Book Sandwiched In is a program of the New Haven Free Public Library. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. And before we get started, I want to send my appreciation to my library colleague, Rory Martorana, who is providing technical support, and also to Reference Department Head Seth Godfrey. Seth organized this talk with the New Haven Peace Commission. The New Haven Peace Commission was established by the city to promote the cause of peace, in particular by educating us about arms reduction, the causes of war, conflict resolution, and nuclear disarmament. And the Peace Commission is co-sponsoring today's event. And our guest today is Michael Brenes. Dr. Brenes is the Associate Director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy and lecturer in history at Yale University. In addition to his academic articles and book chapters, his work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, Foreign Policy, and The Nation, among other outlets. And last year, he published the book For Might and Right, Cold War Defense Spending and the Remaking of American Democracy. Michael Brenes, welcome to Book Sandwiched In.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So your book, For Might and Right, I read and enjoyed, and I think, from my perspective, it was really ambitious. As the subtitle says, not only you're talking about U.S. defense spending during the Cold War, you're also explaining how, in many ways, that defense spending influenced political trends in the country, remaking American democracy, maybe even several times over. So you say in your introduction, Cold War defense spending transformed the nature of social democracy in the United States, altering American politics and creating a unique coalition of individuals vested in the military-industrial complex for personal and political gain. To get into that thesis, can you sketch out an overview of the Cold War just to kind of get us oriented? I know these are kind of open questions, but broadly speaking, when did the Cold War begin? What were the different phases of it? When did it end? Did it end?
Sure. So thank you, Isaac, and also thank you to everyone who's joined the talk. Thank you to the New Haven Peace Commission for sponsoring the talk, or co-sponsoring the talk. It's great to be giving a local virtual talk, so that's a lot of fun. So in terms of, I'll try to sketch out the historical trajectory of the Cold War as briefly as I can within the context of my book and how I frame the narrative within my understanding of the Cold War, its origins and its evolution. So, there are, of course, debates about this amongst historians, but from my perspective, the Cold War doesn't really begin until about 1946, 1947, because there's a period after World War II where we're trying to figure out, that is, we, the United States, are trying to figure out what is the Soviet Union doing, the behavior of the Soviet Union vis-a-vis the United States, but also more broadly in the world. There are debates, domestic debates, over how to handle the Soviet Union. FDR has died in April of 1945, and that has led to Harry Truman becoming president, and Truman has a much more, I would say, more aggressive approach towards the Soviet Union, but the Cold War hasn't solidified in any sense of the way we would view it as a permanent ideological, political, economic conflict. And so my book tries to figure that out, to figure out the origins of the Cold War. The first two chapters, well, I say the first chapter, I guess, in particular, is really about the bipartisan debate over what exactly is American foreign policy going to be. Are we going to be building up our military forces to confront the threat of the Soviet Union as we eventually do? And if so, what form is that going to look like? So the first part of the book is about how Democrats and Republicans come to terms with a massive defense budget. They believe by 46, 47, after you have the release of the Long Telegram by George Kennan in 1946, the Truman Doctrine in 1947, Marshall Plan in 1948, the evolution of hostilities towards the Soviet Union. They believe that by 48, 49, 50, we're going to have a military budget that displays overwhelming, a preponderance of power, in the words of one historian, overwhelming military power to deter the threat of communism, and this, particularly the spread of communism as the United States sees it spreading into other parts of the world. And that would mean, for my purposes, is that, you know, in Congress, in particular, there's a debate over, should we fund the Air Force? Should, you know, the Republicans are at the time very wary of so-called garrison state. They don't believe that the United States should be, you know, this overwhelming global power, whereas the Democrats do. The Democrats believe in the notion that the United States can both provide domestically for its citizens, but also increase its military budget to unprecedented proportions. And that leads to a consensus being formed by the early 50s that shapes the Cold War in my book going forward, that really comes to the head, comes to a fore in the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, you have an escalation of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. You have the development of an arms race, the development of thermonuclear weapons with the 1950s. The Soviet Union tests its first atomic bomb in 1949, and the Cold War is certainly by 1950 with the Korean War. The advent of the Korean War, the Cold War is firmly in place. By 1960, 61, 62, in particular with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, things start to change when the United States and the Soviet Union almost come to a nuclear war, and there's an amelioration in the conflict that leads to eventually what's called the Limited Test Ban Treaty, passed in 1963, that prohibits atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. And for my purposes, that book, the book tries to make sense of that, how people have been benefiting from a political economy of defense spending, benefiting from the military industrial complex, and now for the first time, well, not the first time, but the most significant time in the Cold War's history, they're facing a significant drawdown in the military budget. I mean, there's a drop in military budget in the 1950s, but now there's a consensus now that we can't fight the Cold War in the same ways that we have in the 50s. And that leads to a reaction, which we can get into domestically, but you know, that I talk about in the book. But then Vietnam comes about in 1965, and Vietnam kind of reignites the Cold War. But so you have 1965 to 1968, 69, the Vietnam War, the defense industry, and Americans who are employed by it doing better. Defense spending ticks up to about 9% of GDP. But then when the Vietnam War becomes a quagmire, as we know it does by 68 with the Tet Offensive, people start to turn against America's Cold War mission. They start to question why we were, obviously they worked, some were always doing this, but a majority of Americans by 68, 69 don't believe that the Vietnam War was worth fighting anymore. They don't believe that the Cold War should be fought in the same ways. And that leads to, by the 1970s, a new consensus, again, that we should be changing how we fight the Cold War. So you have the rise of détente between the Soviet Union and the United States, the so-called opening of China by Nixon in 1972. And that really leads to a thaw in the Cold War until 1979, 1980, when you have the rise presumably a rise of a resurgent Soviet Union, the invasion of Afghanistan being this pivotal moment, Reagan coming into office in 1980, and then Reagan pursuing both arms buildup as well in his attempt to negotiate with the Soviet Union. The Cold War then eventually falling in or coming to an end in 1989, the Soviet Union falling in 1991, and this leading to this sort of post-Cold War moment that we've been grappling with since then. What is America's foreign policy in that context? And so from the 70s to 90s, the book really gets into how people experience a thaw in the Cold War, the jobs that they lost in the process. By the 1980s, those jobs coming back. And then by the late 1980s, end of the Cold War, those jobs going away again. And so the ebbing and flowing of the political economy of the Cold War ebbs and flows with the Cold War overall. And I try to make sense of that in political terms, how people come together to mobilize for jobs and benefits that the Cold War provides, and who they align with ideologically to get what they want from the United States and its federal budget.
So the the backdrop to some of this, I was talking to you before we started, is that a big part of this, the Cold War, is ideological, I guess you could say, and maybe myth making. So when the initial histories of the Cold War were written, they provided one slant. They had one perspective, and later revisionist studies told a very different story, and maybe a more realistic story. Can you give us like a little sketch of what that looked like and where your book fits in?
Sure. So the first histories of the Cold War, well, the term Cold War was coined by Walter Lippmann, the very famous journalist. And so, since the 45, 46, 47, there was discussion of a Cold War. And so the early histories of the Cold War, which were really histories of World War II, started to come from that period, the 45, 46, 47, 48. And the consensus at the time, or what was called the Orthodox school for many historians, was that the Soviet Union was the main aggressor. The Cold War was the Soviet Union's fault. And you see this particularly in the literature of, or the writings of people like Arthur Schlesinger, who was a Cold War liberal and an ally of John F. Kennedy. You see this reflected in other authors and historians too. But the dominant perception was that the reason why we have a Cold War is because the Soviet Union is engaging in an imperial quest for domination, and the United States acts as a bulwark, a check to that aggression. And that starts to change by the 1960s, as you can imagine, for reasons that have everything to do with Vietnam, the falling out of the Cold War consensus that I mentioned that occurs in the 1960s. And even a little bit before then, in the 1950s, writers like Walter Lefebvre is one, but William Appleman Williams, whose famous book, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, offered a new perspective on foreign policy altogether, and that had a more nuanced approach. And people, historians like Walter Lefebvre, Gabriel Kokol, Thomas McCormick, Williams, many of McCormick, Kokol, and Lefebvre, they were students of Williams, who was teaching at University of Wisconsin-Madison, the so-called Wisconsin School of American Foreign Policy. They start to criticize the Orthodox historians and say, really, if you look at the historical record, the Soviet Union is to blame. I'm sorry, the United States is to blame. The Soviet Union is actually engaging in some type of negotiations. They don't really, or they're on the fence. They don't really want a Cold War, but it's really Truman and his belligerence and his ignorance of diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the war, which he was. Truman was kept in the dark for much of FDR's fourth term, because FDR didn't really want to bring Truman in for many reasons that we don't need to get into. But his sort of parochial vision of the war, World War II, and how to defeat the Soviet Union, or how to confront the Soviet Union, really caused the Soviet Union to push back. And so it's really the story of the Cold War is a story of the United States aggression towards the Soviet Union and its ignorance or altogether disinterest in engaging in a amelioration of a conflict or betterment of U.S. Soviet relations. That picture starts to change by the 1970s, where you get a group of historians who are not revisionists or not orthodox historians, but they're like neo-revisionists, or you call them to a certain extent, where they say really that the Cold War is both the United States' fault and the Soviet Union's fault. So you have people like Melvin Leffler, historians like Melvin Leffler, John Gaddis is saying this in the 70s. And the reason why they draw that conclusion is because there's new documentation that's opened up. The historical record is more clear. And the Soviet Union made some missteps. The United States had some missteps, but they kind of both stumbled into this Cold War. And the question of blaming one side or the other really isn't useful. And those are the three main schools. And we've kind of gone back with between consensus historians and revisionist, or I'd say more neo-revisionist historians. The major questions that historians are asking about the Cold War now are, how did people experience the Cold War? Not so much just who is to blame or the country that's to blame, but how do people experience the Cold War from the bottom up, social movements? How do they use the Cold War, like the Civil Rights Movement, to create social change? How did people in the global South, so-called global South, in Africa and Asia, how did they experience the Cold War? And my book is somewhat an attempt to kind of go back to that revisionist school of foreign policy, which particularly looked at political economy and domestic politics as the foundation for American power. And I believe, in this book and in my current work, and my overarching thinking about history and about America's role in the world, that domestic politics, the domestic foundations of American foreign policy play a significant role, the most important role, I would think, in how America wields its power. And the book is really, therefore, an attempt to kind of answer questions that political historians have asked about liberalism and conservatism, because I also consider myself a political historian as much as a historian of US foreign relations. There's a lot of literature about conservatism and history of conservatism and how that shaped politics. I view the question of the Cold War really as a question of liberalism, like how liberals shaped the Cold War, which is what they did, Cold War liberals, and how they set the foundations for a right-wing movement to kind of exploit the fissures within liberalism and the gaps that liberals opened up in terms of how to provide for people through a national security state, like those kind of pitfalls, and tried to sort of look at the domestic sources of America's overall imperial reach. And the book's kind of interdisciplinary in that sense. So avoiding those sort of that long, as much as I try to avoid those three schools, invariably historians of the Cold War end up somehow in them. And I think I would put myself more in that second camp or revisionist school, but not adopting wholesale the arguments of the revisionists, but trying to add to them in some capacity.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, that was really a very full explanation, because I mean, the reason that I asked that is because, as you explained, your book grapples with the facts on the ground, political economy, domestic politics, and people, as well as people's experience. You frequently cite individuals' testimonies, just regular taxpayers and employees of various defense companies. And so I guess, I mean, we could kind of get into it. I wanted to ask you about, to go sort of point by point, after World War II, it sounded like World War II and the New Deal actually, they created a lot of employment. And you note that the New Deal was really a massive public works program designed to stimulate employment while building American infrastructure. And those programs, like the Public Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration, spent hundreds of millions of dollars on, I think, so-called defense projects. So were those actually, those weren't building up defense, those weren't, building up military power. They were just defense funds that were being allocated for civilian purposes?
They serve both. So, I mean, one of the points I make in the book, this is not my original point, but I use it to make a larger point about how the Cold War national security state is indebted to New Deal liberalism, is that the New Deal functions in a way, in certain extent, the debates we're having now about infrastructure, functions in a way to say, well, this is a national, like, we need to build up potentially our national security resources. The Navy in particular is a key area of the military that gets a lot of money from the New Deal. But we can build up our military resources, which provide obviously shoring up our national security interests, but we can do so in ways that provide employment, increase employment to more Americans, at a time when you can see a burgeoning welfare state, or what becomes kind of in many ways part of the modern American welfare state. You have first unemployment insurance, you have Social Security created in 1935. We don't yet have like Medicare, which comes later in 65, but we have sort of an understanding that companies can get subsidies from the government to stay afloat. Like there's price controls on commodities at this time, and other things that we can provide for Americans through defense spending at the same time, while providing for Americans through social welfare spending. And you're right, millions of dollars gets allocated through the Public Works Administration, the PWA, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, these like alphabet soup of New Deal agencies that are created from 33 to 37 and beyond even. They are sending money to shipyards in particular. That will change during the outbreak of World War II, where the New Deal kind of transitions into funneling the monies into the war, producing aircraft and things like that for the war. But my point in the book is to say that this is a liberal project, right? These are Democrats, largely by and large, are supporting this. The Republicans make up a very slim minority in Congress. They have no real power at this time, and you have a situation where even if they are Republicans resisting this, they can't do much. But when the war breaks out in 1939, and when the United States joins the war in 1941, FDR becomes sort of Dr. New Deal to Dr. Win the War is the expression. And so FDR is very much thinking about how you can use the precedent of the New Deal, the agencies that were created during the New Deal, for wartime purposes. And Democrats see and liberals see a possibility to funnel many of the monies that went for New Deal projects into the war. And you see a lot of the infrastructure that's there created during the New Deal kind of being reformulated, remade in a certain way, and put towards the war effort, which, as I'm sure some of you know in the audience, leads to the United States not only winning the war, but ending the Great Depression, creating near full employment through war production. 46% of the United States budget overall is going into the military, 46% of GDP. So by the end of the war, there's a huge concern that we're going to lose jobs, and that Americans through demobilization are going to be out of work. We're going to enter into a new recession, if not depression. And by this point, in 1946, you have no longer the situation in 1936, 1937, where Republicans don't have much of a say in legislation, but by 46, 47, Republicans make up a majority in Congress. They control Congress. And so it becomes very hard for the Democrats, the New Deal liberals, now eventually becoming Cold War liberals, to pursue a policy of both a social welfare state along the lines that we see in the New Deal, and a national security state or full employment through a national security state. And the decision is kind of made, and I think it's very much somewhat of a conscious decision to say, well, if we can't get a lot of what we want on the domestic side, and Truman does want a so-called fair deal, a national health insurance program, for instance, strengthening labor unions. Truman vetoes Taft-Hartley, which is basically trying to, it doesn't work. I mean, it gets passed eventually, but tries to put a death knell to unions and to union collective bargaining rights and things like that, right to work laws. If we can't get those things, we can at least generate employment through defense spending. And the Republicans kind of get on board with this, because it becomes very hard for Republicans to say, no, we don't want monies for national security purposes. We don't want to build up our resources to fight the Cold War and to prevent a communist attack. And they, by 46, 47, 48, 49, those so-called I don't like this term, but isolationist Republicans or non-interventionist Republicans accept that the United States is going to have a massive defense budget, to fight the Cold War, and they see how they can benefit from it, how they, as congressional officials, and how their constituents can benefit from it. And that, therefore, is again a problem of I think liberalism in the transition from the New Deal to World War II to the Cold War.
So that would be during that period, someone like Robert Taft in the late 40s and early 50s. I think he died in 53.
Yes.
He died pretty young or prematurely, who was some called an isolationist Republican, someone who wouldn't have been interested in that sort of in all this like defense spending, overseas exploitations. But he's eventually acceding to the pressure for defense spending.
Yeah, and Taft is a good example. I use him as an example in the book of someone who doesn't believe that the United States should retrench its foreign policy, but believes that we can't have a garrison state, but we have to have some kind of military presence. But Taft wants to allocate monies to the Air Force, thinking that this is a relatively cheap way to air power, relatively cheap way to ensure national security interests without creating a global empire, right? Where you don't have to have military bases around the world. You have an air presence that's well funded. We can attack any country very quickly. But that still, as I say in the book, that still means that the United States is going to have a preponderant, relatively compared to previous years and certainly decades, preponderant presence around the globe, and that's going to lead to Taft coming on board with Democrats in many ways, and then by certainly the Korean War, when September 1950, October 1950. Korean War breaks out and the Chinese get involved in the Korean War, and then it leads to a stalemate. That's when you start to see right-wing Republicans shift in their thinking, and Taft is bombastic at times in his support for a more aggressive foreign policy, and that's by this consensus when this consensus is formed, I think by 53.
So then, jumping way forward, is that at all an earlier reflection of what Nixon and Kissinger did when, and really, it seemed like most of the presidents eventually felt like the amount of defense expenditures were inefficient, and they wanted to maintain defense expenditures, but in what they saw as a more cost-efficient way. And maybe the trouble was that was, costing jobs, and a lot of politicians and workers were very upset about that. And support for keeping that money, flowing into these defense companies was ginned up by politicians in those districts, and also by the movement conservatives.
Yes. So I mean, most presidents and congressional officials even advocate for a military budget that exceeds the previous fiscal year's military budget. There's certainly demand within the military for more resources for updating, and what they would view as antiquated equipment, and if you're in the Navy, ships, if you're in the Air Force, planes, there's a consistent call for and coalition of interests that believe that there's never enough defense spending, that we could always do more. And that's certainly the case even today. Those pressures are existing, and you see President Biden's proposed defense budget for next fiscal year exceeds even Trump's, and Trump was, no, he was no retrencher in terms of foreign policy, if that's a word. And that's one thing I look at in the book, is sort of the coalition, what I call the Cold War coalition of interests, who mobilized behind more defense spending, even when the defense spending that is requested is not needed, even when the foreign policy atmosphere, the overall climate has changed. Certainly, for instance, for my purposes in the book, there's a whole chapter on Vietnam and that period after 69, from 69 really to 72, 73, when there is, again, an opposition to the Vietnam War that has existed in the anti-war movement in college campuses, but now has blossomed into a consensus that, many people don't support the anti-war movement's tactics, but they think the Vietnam War is not worth fighting anymore. There's a larger critique of America's Cold War. There's attention to the military-industrial complex, this term that was first coined by Dwight Eisenhower in his farewell speech in 1961. There are books and TV shows, even on like how the Pentagon is at the mercy of defense contractors. And there's what I view as an overall culture of anti-militarism in the United States that really is unprecedented during the Cold War. And I think to a certain extent, even now, I mean, maybe it's kind of coming back with the critique of the forever wars and endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And there's this overarching, notion that we can't be fighting the Cold War in the ways, but then you see organization from business groups, defense contractors, people who are employed by those defense contractors, conservative ideologues who believe that now is not the time to pull back on defense spending, that China is still a threat, and that there are other, Vietnam is certainly still a threat, that people like Ronald Reagan certainly believe the Vietnam War is still worth fighting, and even some Cold War liberals who might have some quibbles with certain defense programs, but believe that the United States still needs to maintain a high defense budget and needs to confront communism. People like Henry Jackson, for instance, a Democrat from Washington, Scoop Jackson, even people like Hubert Humphrey, who's out of office at this time, but believes that the United States still needs to be fighting the Cold War. There are others too, but it's this very interesting coalition of people who kind of work from the bottom to the top up, and top down, top to the bottom down, to pressure Nixon to increase the defense budget. And Congress is facing this as well. They have their constituents who want defense spend, who want to keep their jobs from defense spending, but they also know that the foreign policy climate is not in favor of that. They themselves personally, ideologically, don't feel that the United States needs to be fighting the Vietnam War and fighting the Cold War in the same ways. So they're caught in this as well. And the story I tell, and this is the story I tell kind of throughout the book, is that there is this significant pressure placed upon elected officials to reduce defense spending, but then along comes a recession or economic crisis of some kind, which is what you see in 69, 70, 71, where you start to see unemployment increase, you start to see inflation, the origins of the inflation crisis, stagflation, as it was coined by the 1970s. And this puts pressure upon politicians to make sure that jobs are kept, that the political economy of the Cold War continues to function as as an agent of employment. And you start to see more Americans still lose their jobs who work from the defense industry, pressure politicians, try to align with conservative groups or try to align with certain figures to mobilize behind increased defense spending. You see, for instance, in 71, the Lockheed Group, the defense contractor Lockheed, almost goes bankrupt because of poor investments in airplanes, particularly the C-5. It's called the C-5A plane. They're about to go bankrupt, and they mobilize to their workers, employees of the company, sure, but the towns in which they operate in California and Georgia, conservatives in Congress, the ones that aren't kind of libertarian leaning. There are some like Barry Goldwater, who was a candidate in '64, actually kind of opposes the bailout, but Lockheed is bailed out, and it's seen as a in 1971 as a relief to workers, as an opportunity for workers to keep their jobs. And it becomes very hard throughout the 70s to say the United States should cut defense spending, because people then will lose their jobs in this period of austerity. And I think that's kind of the legacy we're left with, is that we have a situation where the political economy of America's foreign policy creates jobs for people that they don't want to get rid of. And at a time of austerity, when jobs are being cut, it becomes much difficult to say cut the defense budget, because then the jobs argument will come out, and then a coalition of actors, even those who aren't materially benefiting from the defense industry, will come out and say, yes, that's right, the jobs will be cut. And then you have this reciprocal exchange between ideological and economic interests that keeps America's defense budget the way it is, at least maybe not the same in terms of numbers, but still functioning the way it's functioning as a in keeping America's power globally the way it is, and also providing jobs to Americans.
Well, it is a little, it's complicated, it seems, because at the, in the late 60s, 68, after the Tet Offensive, the American public maybe is losing confidence in the war, losing patience. But then also, and then in 1971, you have, I think, maybe the chief executive or the president of DuPont coming out against the war, it sounded like, and some other business leaders saying similar things. And then you also have the Hard Hat Riot in 1970 in New York. And you talk in your book about members of the New Left, young people on the left who are finding themselves really in opposition to blue collar workers. And because they see them as perpetuating the war, and some blue collar workers, in this case, I guess they were construction workers, were attacking protesters in 1970. So it just can be kind of hard to get a real sense of, what was the consensus of the country at these different points? Because then by the early 70s, you're starting to have recession, and it's creating more concern about jobs again.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think the way the Hard Hat riots function is that they are used as a political tool by Nixon and other conservatives to say, this is why the left is wrong, or it's a cudgel to use against the left, right? To say that the average, it's a trope, right? The average Joe, the average, quote unquote, supports the war, and Nixon's like, can we get more of these kind of hard riots? I mean, it's kind of, and it's true. He's very much kind of wanted to publicize this, to say that this is the silent majority, the quote unquote silent majority, a term that comes it consistently comes back in our political discourse, in our lexicon, and he is, and then again, not just Nixon, but other conservatives are saying, the war is still very popular, or people don't like the tactics again in the anti-war movement. But there is something materially to that, in the sense that you're right, that the New Left, it's very much, I think, sort of the class contours of the left are shaping how its limitations, or shaping its limitations, how it goes forward in terms of building coalitions. And it's not just the class contours of it. I think there are other, obviously, the opposition to the left and Nixon and many things that are going on there. But one of the things that happens, you start seeing, particularly after the 70s, is that defense workers who are unionized start to lose their jobs, or experience decline in benefits or decline in pay. And they're just angry. They're angry at several individuals and institutions. They're angry at their company, but in particular, they're angry at the federal government. They believe that the federal government has turned their back on them. They're not, interested in their best interest. And this, kind of unfortunately for the left, kind of coincides, this economic crisis kind of coincides at a time when you have the Democratic Party, rightfully so, I think, saying we need to get out of the war. We need, George McGovern in 1972 becomes the Democratic candidate running for office. McGovern says we need to cut the defense budget, by, I think it's like $90 billion or something like that. His amount, maybe it's less than that, 13 billion or something. But billions of dollars of defense funds need to be cut and reallocated to, or allocated to, social welfare projects, to jobs and healthcare, green jobs, quote unquote. This is an anachronistic term, but this is something that McGovern has been passionate about really since coming into the Senate in '63. Is defense, quote unquote, defense conversion, converting defense programs to civilian purposes, and this is an issue for the left, because the worker, those who are in defense industries and those who are working in towns where the defense industry, controls the economy, they're looking for help from the federal government. The Republicans are not giving, and Nixon is not doing much for them. But then George McGovern's coming in saying, let's cut the defense budget. And they'll say, okay, well, what do you have as an alternative? And McGovern, unfortunately, in the '72 campaign is not clear on the terms in which he would provide an alternative. He just kind of says these sort of vague things about defense conversion. And he has a real substantive plan, but it just doesn't come across. And so you have many Americans who are employed by the defense industry who just don't really like McGovern that much. And like the line I think I put in the book from one of the Lockheed workers is that, Nixon doesn't give him much from us, but neither has McGovern, so I think I'll just stay home. And so the point being that when the Democrats offer an alternative, or don't offer an alternative, an unclear alternative, and the Republicans are not doing much for these workers too, that just breeds apathy. And I think that's kind of a legacy of this, sort of the apathy that no one's helping me, and the federal government is against me. This sort of anti-government politics that later gets exploited in the 1980s by other, Ronald Reagan and other forces, and saying, the government is not doing your best for you. It's not interested in helping you. And that to me is again sort of a problem of certainly liberalism, but then how conservatives exploit that problem, I think is what we're dealing with now, and how austerity is mobilized as a political tool in this context.
It's a very interesting situation because it seems to indicate that the material circumstances on the ground are much more influential maybe than native ideology, whatever that is. So, for example, you make the point that Carter, who preceded Reagan, actually in his first State of the Union address specifically said, government is really not the solution here. Government is not going to provide bounty and all these things. And it was Reagan who was famous for saying, the worst words you can hear are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Mm-hmm. So I guess I wanted to ask you about, whether those trends at all of, lessening faith in the government, diminishing faith in the government relate to the movement conservatives, because William F. Buckley pops up, really frequently throughout the book. Mm-hmm. And it seems as though he's not quite a neoconservative, but he's sort of the father of that movement. And these people like Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, you talk about, were actually working for Democrats. And right. They came to staff the Bush administration. These were the people that executed the war in Iraq, at least Wolfowitz. And it is kind of hard to follow the trajectory and to try to answer the question, which I guess a lot of people are trying to answer: what is conservatism today? Mm-hmm. Where do the Democratic and Republican parties stand today?
No, it's a great question. I would say that there's a lot of good literature on this. And Corey Robin has written a very good book on the conservative mind, for instance, sort of intellectual developments of conservatism. There's other books by Kevin Cruz and Matt Lasseter on conservatism in the South. And there's other books on sort of like Benjamin Waterhouse on business conservatism. Kim Phillips Fine has written about business conservatism. This is just a point to say that there are many kind of conservatisms, right? There are many different conservatives, I think, as you're alluding to. And I tried to avoid in the book sort of discussion of conservatism as a monolithic thing, and as an entity that kind of we can make sense of in a clear sense. I think that's kind of what Trump has proved, is that conservatism is inherently contradictory. It's a hodgepodge of different interests and people who wouldn't necessarily identify as conservatives. Some certainly do, but then some who don't, who just are upset and angry and want to vote for somebody who is going to upturn the consensus. In addition, there's also just diehard, activist conservatives who have been fighting their fight for decades. And to kind of answer your question as best I can, I think Buckley is one of those figures, those diehard conservatives. Goes to Yale, gets disenchanted with the politics at Yale, which he says are very liberal. Writes this book called God and Man at Yale, becomes founder or part publisher, editor-in-chief of National Review in 1955. Is trying to make conservative, quote unquote, respectable, inviting certain people to write for National Review, working alongside conservative activists. And Buckley is one of those figures who opposes Nixon's opening to China. He's just, the fight against communism is never enough. And then you have people who write, like Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, who work for Scoop Jackson. They're aides to Henry Jackson, who I mentioned earlier as a Democrat from Washington, and they are conservatives on foreign policy, and like the so-called neoconservatives, which I think is a slippery term, but they start to materialize in the 70s, where the Democratic Party starts to reject its earlier origins as the Cold War origins, as building up a massive national security state to fight the Soviet Union. There's a new shift, and these disaffected Cold War liberals align with these Republicans, and they in several groups like the Committee for the Present Danger, and there are others. And then this occurs alongside other, just like sort of, as you're saying, amorphous, discontented people who just don't like what the federal government is doing, which Carter is acquiescing to and paying homage to with, that State of the Union address that you mentioned, just saying government can't do everything for us. There's an attempt by, and you see this very clearly during his administration, not just in foreign policy, but particularly domestic policy as well, where there's an attempt to create a new full employment bill. Hubert Humphrey and Augustus Hawkins create this Humphrey Hawkins Act, and they have a plan for ending unemployment, like reducing, basically be a crime to have unemployment, I think, go below 4%. And the bill gets just diluted by Carter. He doesn't like it. He thinks it's an inflationary tool. Those policies of the Cold War, of the early Cold War, 46, where the full employment bill was first passed, also toothless, but for reasons we don't need to get into, are no longer applicable in this new context. But still, the policies of the Cold War, like this massive defense budget, is still applicable. So this is kind of what we're left with in the 70s. And so this is an opportunity, again, the sort of the structural foundations for this are an opportunity for various conservatives to mobilize and use various tools, rhetorical tools that have been around for decades, as I point out in the book, to offer again as a cudgel to the left to sort of say, like, the left is not interested, it's not pro-worker, it's like reducing the defense budget is going to eliminate jobs. We're also not going to be able to fight the Soviet Union at a time when the Soviet Union is resurgent. And so there's a conservative sentiment, or that's more right-leaning sentiment, that gets appropriated by conservative figures. And this kind of creates a politics of conservatism that, again, as you said, is kind of hard to pin down, I think, where it ultimately ends up. I think its sources are quite clear, but I think where it ends up and who takes the mantle of it and how it evolves over time, I think is interesting. And again, it's inherently contradictory and certainly problematic, but doesn't quite get us a sense of like what conservatism is, because again, I don't think that's a very useful kind of thing. I think there's many conservatisms, and they're operating in ways that to me indicate the weakness of the left, or the weakness of liberals, I should say, and not so much the left, but the liberals to offer an alternative. I think the problem of conservatism is a problem of liberalism that needs to be addressed in ways that unfortunately many liberals didn't during the Cold War.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's something that I see today, and it sounds like we can see in Carter's acquiescence to this diminishing faith in the government. I guess if you're not going to commit to significant social spending programs, there's really not much of an alternative choice, and so you're not really offering much. if you're here and you have a question, we just have 5-10 minutes left. So please put your question in the chat, or if you're watching on Facebook, you can put it in there. There's one question here from Aaron Good, City of New Haven Peace Commissioner. So I just wanted to read that out. He says, thank you, Dr. Brenes, for the excellent book, and to NHFPL for the series of book talks. My question is, could you comment on Eisenhower's famous military-industrial complex speech at the end of his presidency, and how it's been misinterpreted both by historians and the lay public? What was Eisenhower actually warning about and trying to say in that well-known but little understood 1961 speech?
Good question. So the draft, I mean, Eisenhower, what's interesting about Eisenhower, of course, he's a Republican. And Eisenhower presides over the escalation of the arms race in the 1950s, and he is responsible for, in many ways, the strengthening of the so-called military-industrial complex. You start to see defense contractors flourish in parts of the South and in the West, the so-called Sun Belt. You start to see defense contractors go from, spring up from North Carolina, more South Carolina in particular, into Florida, and into Texas and California. What one historian has called the gun belt, because it looks like a gun belt from the Northeast in Connecticut, New York, down through Florida into Texas and up to California. And so Eisenhower was responsible for that expansion of the political economy of the Cold War. But yet he also, being a Republican that he is concerned about the undue influence, as he calls it or sees it, of government and defense, military, and he's also a military general too, of defense companies in the political outcomes of the United States, and certainly with American foreign policy. And he sees this nexus between not just the military, who, many of these, it's still to this day, military officials who retire go and work as consultants for defense contractors on advising them on how to get defense contracts. But this nexus between the military and industry, and the word that gets taken out of that speech is Congress, the military-industrial congressional complex. So how military and industry lobby Congress for defense funds. And he believes that this is a kind of corrupting influence on American democracy. And again, it's interesting that you associate this term with the left and critiques of American imperial power, but this is a Republican who's saying this. And there's a book on this called I think it's called Unwarranted Influence by James Ledbetter, if you're interested in this more, which is the evolution of the speech. But the way that it's interpreted is that you have, in the 1960s, these congressional calls, particularly William Fulbright, into investigations into the military and their political influences. So how the military, like the anti-communism of the military, and like the attempt to sort of indoctrinate, not by all, but by a select few of military officials, indoctrinate soldiers under the command with like anti-communist right-wing propaganda. This is in so-called Fulbright hearings. This is what William Fulbright does, and says this is like the military should be separate from politics. And then the term gets appropriated during the Vietnam War by the left to say like there's this nexus between the military, industry, and labor, and which is what you pointed out earlier, Isaac. So this connection between the labor and military and industry that gets used by the left. And I think that's when the Vietnam War is when this term gets associated with the left, I think. But it really was not a nod to the left. It was really sort of Eisenhower's thinking about how politics should be separated from the military, and how politicians should not be subject to material financial pressures from industry in ways that would create create conflicts for the United States, or lead the United States into conflicts that it wasn't necessarily being involved in. That's kind of a classical republicanism, kind of, that's a Taft, the United States should be very circumspect in where it goes in search of monsters, to kind of butcher another phrase by John Quincy Adams. But I think that to me is where that speech comes from, and I think now it's one that I think still has some utility, but maybe not as much. It's come too loaded, perhaps, but I still use it. So yeah.
At the risk then of saying something pretty ignorant, does Trump indicate a change in the Republican Party, at least, of prominent Republicans in power who are really espousing what could be called a more isolationist perspective?
No, I don't think so. I think Trump is not an isolationist. I don't like the term isolationism. I think there's never been a time in the United States history where it's isolationist. That's all, talk about a loaded term. I think that's a loaded term. To me, and this is not my conclusion, but this is Stephen Wertheim's conclusion. He's a historian and was at Quincy Institute, but now I think is at Carnegie Council. But he calls Trump a militarist, and I think that's true. Trump is a militarist, and he is a quintessential militarist. For all of Trump's, seemingly interest in reducing or America's commitment abroad or ending endless wars, if you look at his record, at least in my view, the fact is that Trump actually presided over an expansion of American military power. I mean, the assassination of Soleimani, like the use of American military power that consistently, his demand for more defense spending, his just naked, desire for military dominance, I think, doesn't at all spell isolationism. Even though, he pulled out pulled troops out of the Kurdish region. He was talking about in the war in Afghanistan, and Biden came along and did it. To me, Trump is not a departure from Republicans or Democrats past. I think he's a continuation of it, and he's a modification of it. Even though he could call out the consensus of foreign policy making, I think still he operated within that consensus.
He, of course, was not in favor of so-called humanitarian interventions, the interventions of Hillary Clinton and Samantha Power, and as I think you're pointing out here, Obama oversaw a vast expansion of the drone program, and I guess what I'm pointing out is that it feels a little bit like a lot of there haven't been a lot of advocacy for major ground wars. It's more that there's a complex, infrastructure of bases and sanctions and regular bombing, often with drones, that is just kind of the modus operandi, par for the course.
Right. I think that's right. And then quick plug for Samuel Moyn's new book, Humane, which is about this, like the expansion of the drone campaign and how waging war humanely, as Obama tries to do, is actually expanding endless wars and reframing them. So there's more to come on this, but you're absolutely right. And I would agree with everything you said.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. I just wanted to very briefly say that if you're interested, in 2 weeks, we will be talking to Professor Lewis Gordon of UConn about his book, and we'll be looking forward to, believe it or not, a talk with Noam Chomsky in mid-September. So please stay tuned to our programs. And Dr. Michael Brenes, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Isaac. It's been a pleasure, and appreciate the conversation and you reading my book. It's great.
Yeah, absolutely. You too. Take care, everyone.